In the hush of a normal suburban evening, something dark and irreversible was about to unfold. Stay tuned as we peel back the hours leading up to one of New Jersey's most chilling family tragedies. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next chapter. On New Year's Eve 2017, the house at 31 Wall Street in the city of Long Branch sat quiet under the low winter light. The family inside believed they were merely ushering in a new year, but in minutes the ordinary would be shattered. 16-year-old Scott Kologi was present that evening, though he did not move with his family's energy. His mother, Linda Kologi, age 42, and father, Stephen Kologi, age 44, hosted the gathering. Also present was his older sister Brittany Kologi, age 18, home from college on winter break. Under the same roof, his grandfather and his grandfather's companion, Mary Schultz, age 70, sat in conversation in the basement lounge. The setting seemed typical. A family celebration. A safe place. But beneath the surface, something was not right. Scott kept mostly to himself. Even his family recognized the distance in him, quiet, isolated, separate. Scott's educational path was different. He attended a school for students with special needs. According to records presented at trial, his classification was multiple disabilities. The family believed he might have had a benign brain tumor, and developmental delays were documented in his earlier years. He did not seem to form bonds easily. His brother testified that Scott kept to himself a lot, read books, watched television, or played video games. He was very isolated and did not have many friends. The school records noted bullying in his earlier years when he attended public school. Then he moved into a more supportive environment. But the scars of being different lingered. He had virtually no social life, and according to medical legal filings, he often appeared emotionally flat and detached. His mother, Linda, worried. Not publicly, but quietly. She had heard him mutter troubling things. On a family car trip in 2017, for instance, Scott told his mother he wanted to talk to the shrink at school because he was having bad thoughts about hurting the neighbor's kid. There were other comments too, jokes perhaps made in poor taste, when he picked up a game piece shaped like a gun and said, "I'm going to kill you all." The aunt who witnessed it recorded the moment, saying the remark was made but then shrugged off by the mother. The family, however, dismissed the mood swings and distant behavior as part of his special needs condition. Linda feared if Scott told his therapist all the thoughts he had, he might end up hospitalized, so she discouraged him from sharing everything. As the evening rolled on, the gathering dwindled. Some friends left, the adults chatted quietly, the children had moved off to bedrooms or were watching a movie. For Scott, the loneliness deepened. He went upstairs to his room, shut off the lights, and settled into darkness. According to his later statements, he did this intentionally. In the closet of that room sat his brother's semi-automatic rifle, unlocked, unsecured, as the brother had removed it from the gun safe, citing rust concerns. At precisely 11:43 p.m., a 911 call would later be logged from within this home. But at this moment, the house was still a sanctuary of sorts: family, celebration, end of one year, hope for the next. For Scott, the heavy weight of his internal turmoil pressed closer. He later told investigators he had thought for a year or two about hurting his family, that the thoughts built up, and on this night they coalesced. Because of his classification under an IEP, Scott's record noted ADHD symptoms and a brain anomaly, though no formal diagnosis of tumor was ever confirmed. His family worried. His paternal grandmother testified at trial that the family believed the anomaly was a tumor. Some of Scott's own statements reflected that fear. Yet the official evidence did not confirm a tumor. The seriousness of his isolation, though, stood out. His brother described Scott as someone who slept with his parents every night, as a teenager, and still believed in Santa Claus past the age his peers no longer did. With fewer guests, the house breathed slower. The laughter faded, and the countdown to midnight began to feel real. For most, it was just another transition, one year ending, another beginning. For the Kologi family, the the final minutes of 2017 would mark something far more tragic. Unbeknownst to the family gathering downstairs, Scott was preparing. He retrieved the rifle, loaded ammunition. He wore earplugs. He dressed in a black jacket and sunglasses, resembling his Terminator costume. Meanwhile, downstairs, his mother called him again. "Scott, come here!" And the world outside and inside both paused. The clock ticked toward midnight. The dull hum of the stereo, the glow of the holiday lights, the whispers of hope for the new year, they all hung in the air. In the moments before midnight, the ordinary nature of the night masked an extraordinary evil about to be unleashed. The family believed everything would turn the page to a new year together. They had no idea the countdown was for more than champagne and kisses. In the next segment, we'll examine how the clock struck and what happened in the silent seconds after midnight. Stay tuned as we uncover the plan, the weapon, and the fatal transformation of New Year's celebration into a massacre. Just before midnight, inside the Kologi household in Long Branch, New Jersey, time seemed to slow. The gathering was winding down. The house, typically filled with the rhythms of a large family, mother, father, 2 brothers, a sister, and their grandfather and his companion, was quietening. Linda Kologi, 44, and Stephen Kologi, 42, were preparing to usher in a new year with their loved ones. Also present were their daughter, Brittany Kologi, 18, home on break from her freshman year of college, their son, Stephen Kologi Jr., and his girlfriend, and Stephen Kologi Sr.'s partner, Mary Schultz, 70. The atmosphere was one of typical New Year's Eve anticipation, completely at odds with the terror that was moments away from eruption. Then in those final moments of the year, one figure moved deliberately, and changed everything. Scott had prepared. The 16-year-old had retreated to his room as the party continued downstairs. He prepared the weapon with ammunition. His actions were calculated, far from a spontaneous outburst. He had previously familiarized himself with the weapon's operation. This detail pointed to a premeditated nature of the crime, suggesting a concerted effort to acquire the necessary, lethal skills. He wore earplugs to muffle the sound, a chilling indication that he was actively trying to minimize his own distress while maximizing the surprise and effectiveness of his attack. The weapon, a Century Arms C-39 V2 semi-automatic AK variant rifle, was legally owned by his brother but not secured. The devastating 7.62 by 39 mm rounds fired by this high-powered weapon were designed for military use, ensuring the carnage that followed. He planned beyond the living room. Prosecutors discovered he had researched specific details about the weapon's lethality. This key piece of evidence suggested an intent that extended beyond the family unit, hinting at a broader, potentially suicidal confrontation with law enforcement. Scott's inner turmoil, which he would later confess had been building for a year or two, found its physical manifestation in the unsecuring of this powerful firearm. Linda believed she was calling her son into the family fold, a final, tender gesture before the midnight countdown. Scott's motion was silent. He didn't answer, he waited. The door to his room closed. He slipped into the darkness. This descent into the dimly lit hallway marked the point of no return. In the living room, children and guests chatted quietly, glasses in hand, unaware of the unfolding horror that was now mere feet away. The contrast between the festive chatter and the armed, silent figure stalking the upstairs hallway is a harrowing image of domestic betrayal. One shot. A father rushing to see what happened. The sequence of events revealed a calculated execution rather than a frenzied spree. Scott moved methodically. Prosecutors say the first victim was his mother, Linda Kologi, 44, who was fatally shot in the hallway. The father heard the shot and ascended the stairs. Scott fired again, fatally shooting his father, Stephen Kologi, 42. The killing did not stop upstairs. After executing his parents, the teenager walked around their bodies, descended the stairs, and entered the kitchen and living area where the remaining family members were gathered. He then calmly shot his sister and his grandfather's companion. Mother, father, sister, family friend. Brittany Kologi, 18, was shot in the head and chest while sitting in a kitchen chair. Mary Schultz, 70, the companion of Scott's grandfather, was struck one time. All were tragically struck inside the home. The horror layered by the very relationships meant to protect. The motive remained murky, but the planning clear. Scott told investigators he had thoughts of hurting his family for a year or two, and that this night everything came together. Investigators learned that Scott had allegedly previously expressed these dark thoughts to his mother, who, fearing he would be hospitalized, discouraged him from sharing them with his therapist. This tragic refusal to seek professional help for his acknowledged mental distress would prove fatal. The survivors ran. The grandfather and brother escaped, including Scott's brother, who had stored the rifle and yet watched the attack unfold from outside. Scott's brother's girlfriend hid behind the refrigerator and was the one who initially called 911. The shooting lasted minutes, but the damage would last a lifetime. At 11:43 p.m., a call for help triggered police response to the family residence on Wall Street in Long Branch, New Jersey, though the carnage in full view was only about to end. Police found Scott compliant. He said, "I don't have the rifle." Hands raised. He placed the gun aside. In total 14 shots were fired. 12 victims struck, a reference to 12 hits on the 4 victims. The weapon, a Century Arms C39 V2 AK variant rifle purchased by his brother about a year earlier, was removed from a safe because rust formed, an almost mundane detail that enabled the atrocity. In 2022, Scott, now 20, was sentenced to 150 years in prison, subject to the No Early Release Act, meaning he must serve at least 85% of his sentence, or approximately 127.5 years, before he becomes eligible for parole. This sentence was handed down by Monmouth County Superior Court Judge Mark C. Lemieux, who stated his intention was that Scott never see the light of the outside of a jail cell ever again. At trial, prosecutors described his acts as evil and deliberate, arguing he killed them because he could. He killed them because he wanted to. Defense argued he suffered from early-onset schizophrenia and dissociative episodes. His attorneys painted a picture of a severely mentally ill child who had begged his mother for help and was denied it, suggesting a plea for compassion and understanding rather than a conviction as a cold-blooded killer. Ultimately, the jury found him guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder and a second-degree weapons offense, a verdict that acknowledged the premeditated and intentional nature of his actions. The transition from celebration to horror happened in seconds. The countdown reached 0. But the new year arrived at the cost of 4 lives. In the place of laughter, screams; in a family's safe space, terror. Scott had planned. He had the weapon. He had the moment. And when only minutes remained to mark time's turning, he acted. In the next part, we will examine the investigation, the legal process, and how this teenage act shook a community and legal system. Stay tuned. The final seconds of 2017 were supposed to bring cheers. Instead, they brought screams and gunfire. 4 innocent lives were extinguished in the quiet suburban home of the Kologi family. Now, the chaos of the crime scene gives way to the chilling calm of a police investigation, as authorities piece together the unspeakable actions of a 16-year-old boy. At 11:43 p.m. on December 31, 2017, the peace of Wall Street in Long Branch, New Jersey, shattered. Calls to the Monmouth County Sheriff's Office reported shots fired. This wasn't a celebratory firework. It was a desperate plea for help. The person who placed the call was the girlfriend of Scott Kologi's older brother, Stephen Kologi Jr., who was hiding behind a refrigerator, her fear paralyzing, her fingers dialing 911 in a frantic race against the shooter. The call triggered an immediate, heavy police response. Officers, trained for every scenario but perhaps not this one, a seemingly isolated domestic massacre on a night of global celebration, arrived swiftly. They approached the house with extreme caution, knowing an active shooter, armed with a powerful weapon, was still inside. The sounds of celebration from neighboring homes provided a horrifying backdrop to the emerging reality. Upon entering the residence, the scene was one of unimaginable carnage. The investigation immediately began at the threshold of the home. Officers entered in formation and almost immediately encountered the aftermath of Scott's systematic violence. They found the 4 victims dead from gunshot wounds in various locations. Linda Kologi, 44, the mother, and Stephen Kologi, 42, the father, were found upstairs, shot after being lured to the hallway. Downstairs, Brittany Kologi, the 18-year-old sister, and Mary Schultz, 70, the grandfather's companion, had been shot in the kitchen and living area, their bodies a testament to the methodical nature of the attack. Monmouth County Assistant Prosecutor Sean Brennan would later describe Scott's actions as casually murdering his sister and Mary Schultz after walking around his parents' bodies. The shooter, Scott Kologi, was quickly located. He was compliant, hands raised, telling the officers, "I don't have the rifle." He had set the weapon aside, his rampage complete, or perhaps interrupted by the sound of the police sirens. 14 shots were fired in total. Investigators confirmed 12 of those rounds found their targets. The weapon, an assault-style rifle, was legally owned by Stephen Kologi Jr., Scott's brother. The brother had removed the firearm from its safe just days earlier because rust was starting to form, keeping it, with ammunition, in the closet of the room he shared with Scott. This logistical oversight, intended to preserve the weapon, tragically enabled the massacre. Scott, a 16-year-old with no prior criminal history, was taken into custody without further incident. Not everyone perished. Stephen Kologi Jr., Scott's brother, and the boy's grandfather survived the attack. Stephen Jr., who had stored the murder weapon, was forced to flee the house, watching the horror unfold from outside before moving away and calling 911. His girlfriend, who was hiding behind the refrigerator, also survived, having been miraculously spared by Scott. Their physical survival was absolute, yet the emotional shock and deep mental scars they carried away from the Long Branch home that night would last a lifetime. The surviving brother later found himself sitting beside the suspect during the police interview. Though a survivor, he was also the legal owner of the murder weapon, a devastating reality that added immense layers of guilt and trauma. Stephen Jr.'s eventual testimony and account of the night painted a picture of a calculated shooter who was stern and cold, without a trace of remorse or emotion during the act. The wider family's reaction was one of pure, disbelieving anguish. Carol Kologi, Scott's paternal grandmother and mother of Stephen Kologi Sr., testified that Scott was a mentally ill child who had needed help, pleading for compassion and understanding. During the subsequent sentencing, Scott's family and friends had previously noted that he had learning disabilities and required special assistance. They described the victims as caring, loving people who were devoted to their children, making the motive for the crime all the more incomprehensible. The image of the sister, Brittany, a Stockton University freshman home on winter break, killed in her kitchen chair, became a symbol of the extinguished potential of the victims. As the investigation moved from the crime scene to the interrogation room, the crucial question emerged: why? What could drive a 16-year-old to commit such a systematic, shocking act of violence against the very people who loved him? Prosecutors immediately argued the massacre was calculated and deliberate. Assistant Prosecutor Sean Brennan stressed that Scott had engaged in extensive planning, from researching the rifle's ability to pierce police body armor to wearing earplugs to shield his hearing from the noise. Scott's own words to detectives were chilling. He had considered hurt, his family for a year or two, and on New Year's Eve, everything aim together. He stated he continued the attack until the victims were incapacitated. This narrative painted him as a cold-blooded killer who acted because he could. He killed them because he wanted to. The defense countered with a compelling argument focusing on Scott's severe mental illness. His attorneys argued that he was a severely mentally ill child who had been denied proper care. Testimony during the trial revealed that Scott had told his mother about his homicidal thoughts, but she, fearing he would be hospitalized, discouraged him from telling his therapist. This tragic failure to address his worsening mental health, the defense argued, was the true catalyst. They presented evidence suggesting Scott suffered from early-onset schizophrenia and dissociative episodes, claiming his actions were the result of a mind severely disconnected from reality, not a conscious, premeditated choice. During the interrogation, Scott even asked investigators if he could be put into a mental institution, and described the shooting as feeling like watching a movie. A sign, his defense argued, of a dissociative state. Due to the heinous and premeditated nature of the crime, Monmouth County Prosecutor Chris Gramiccioni made the decision to charge Scott Kologi as an adult. Despite being a juvenile, the severity of the quadruple homicide warranted the gravest legal response. On January 14, 2020, Scott Kologi, then 18, was indicted by a grand jury on 5 charges, 4 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of his mother, father, sister, and Mary Schultz, and 1 count of a second-degree weapons offense for possessing an assault rifle for an unlawful purpose. His journey through the legal system would be arduous, beginning with a focus on his mental state and his initial statements to the police. The defense immediately moved to suppress his confession, arguing that his Miranda rights were not properly waived and that his older brother, Stephen Jr., had a clear conflict of interest and should not have been allowed to serve as his guardian during the interrogation, a point they would later raise in their appeal. This legal maneuver questioned the very validity of the evidence prosecutors would use to secure a conviction. The Monmouth County Superior Court was the stage for this harrowing legal battle. The central issues shifted from who committed the murders to why and what was Scott's state of mind at the time. The defense leveraged their mental health experts to paint a picture of severe mental illness, hoping to sway the jury toward a lesser charge or a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution steadfastly maintained that his mental health struggles, however real, did not negate the clear evidence of planning and calculation. They argued that Scott, when asked if he knew the difference between right and wrong, replied that he did. The trial was poised to be a difficult balancing act, a question of whether a calculated, evil act could coexist with a deeply disturbed mind. Scott's fate would be determined by a jury asked to look past the tragic circumstances of his life and confront the brutal facts of the crime. His defense team's final plea at the sentencing hearing was heartbreaking. "He's a mentally ill child who begged his mother for help and never got it." But the court ultimately stood with the prosecution's view of a deliberate, horrifying massacre. On a quiet suburban street in Long Branch, New Jersey, a family's New Year's Eve celebration became a bloodbath. 4 lives, a mother, a father, a sister, and a family friend, were extinguished by the son of the house, Scott Kologi. As the shock receded, the legal system stepped in, not just to hold him accountable, but to answer the most chilling question of all: was this the calculated act of an evil mind, or the terrifying consequence of untreated madness? Subscribe to this channel now, and stay tuned as we uncover the harrowing courtroom battle that sought to dissect the mind of a teenage killer. The trial hinged on one central, critical debate: Scott's mental state at the time of the murders. The prosecution argued for method and intent, while the defense pleaded for recognition of a profound madness. This legal battle saw a dramatic clash between forensic psychiatric experts, each presenting a starkly different portrait of the defendant. The defense presented the argument that Scott Kologi was insane at the moment of the killings. Their expert witness diagnosed Scott with early-onset schizophrenia and suggested he was suffering from a dissociative state when he pulled the trigger. Dissociation, the expert explained, is a mental process where a person disconnects from their thoughts, feelings, memories, or sense of identity. To Scott, the murders felt like watching a movie, a classic sign of this severe mental break. The defense contended that his actions were the involuntary result of psychosis, not conscious choice. They argued that his long history of mental health struggles, which went back years, culminated in a break from reality on that fatal night. Conversely, the prosecution presented its own expert, who concluded that Scott was sane and understood the wrongfulness of his actions. This expert testified that while Scott certainly had significant mental health issues, those issues did not meet the legal standard for insanity. The legal definition requires that, at the time of the crime, the defendant was unable to distinguish right from wrong. The prosecution pointed to Scott's planning, loading 2 magazines, wearing earplugs to muffle the sound, and concealing his movement, as concrete proof of premeditation and a clear awareness of the criminal nature of his actions. His very act of hiding the weapon and complying with the police further suggested he understood the consequences of what he had done. The central argument was that mental illness is not the same as legal insanity. To bolster their case for method and intent, the prosecution presented disturbing evidence that painted a picture of premeditation and prior knowledge of Scott's dark thoughts. One piece of evidence that shocked the courtroom was a text message sent by Scott's older brother, Stephen Jr., just months before the massacre. The message reportedly read, "Grandpa says all Scott talks about is killing people." This message confirmed that the family was not only aware of Scott's homicidal ideations but had been for some time. It transformed the motive from a sudden break to a disaster years in the making. Further undermining the defense's argument for a spontaneous psychotic episode was the meticulous planning. Scott had researched the weapon's potential lethality, evidence that his thoughts were focused not just on the killings, but on the potential aftermath and confrontation with law enforcement. His methodical actions, shooting his parents first to eliminate the most immediate threat, then calmly moving downstairs to kill his sister and Mary Schultz, demonstrated a clear, logical progression. The court also reviewed Scott's lengthy school and medical records. These documents detailed a history of significant struggles, a diagnosis of ADHD, documented instances of behavioral issues, and the stress of a previously treated benign brain tumor. He had spent time in a special needs school, and his records highlighted a pattern of isolation and difficulty forming normal social bonds. The defense used these records to argue that Scott was a vulnerable, damaged child whose cry for help, manifested as talk of violence, was ignored, leading to the final tragedy. The prosecution acknowledged the history of mental challenges but maintained that these issues did not absolve him of legal responsibility for the deliberate act of mass murder. The jury was faced with an almost impossible task. They had to weigh the complexity of a disturbed adolescent mind against the brutal simplicity of 4 murders. Their deliberations centered on the crucial intersection of motive, mental illness, planning, and intent. They had to reconcile several conflicting realities. The planning, the research into body armor, and the use of earplugs strongly suggested intent. The illness, the diagnosis of schizophrenia, and the history of mental distress suggested an unstable mind with diminished capacity. The execution, the methodical, non-frenzied nature of the shooting suggested calculation. The family knowledge. The text message regarding his threats indicated the homicidal thoughts were persistent and known to those closest to him. The jury had to decide if Scott Kologi knew, definitively, that what he was doing was legally and morally wrong. If they accepted the defense's argument of legal insanity, Scott would have been sent to a psychiatric hospital, likely for the rest of his life. If they sided with the prosecution, he would be convicted as a cold-blooded killer and face the maximum sentence in prison. The weight of this decision, determining whether a catastrophic crime was an act of pure evil or a tragedy of ignored mental illness, hung over the courtroom. After a tense and thorough deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. They ultimately rejected the claim of legal insanity. Scott Kologi was found guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of his mother, Linda Kologi, his father, Stephen Kologi, his sister, Brittany Kologi, and Mary Schultz. He was also convicted of the second-degree weapons offense for possessing the assault rifle for an unlawful purpose. The verdict affirmed the prosecution's central argument, that the elements of planning, preparation, and control demonstrated during the massacre proved that Scott knew the wrongfulness of his actions. The jury's decision drew a harsh line between a recognized mental illness and the legal standard required for acquittal by reason of insanity. The trial revealed a devastating truth about Scott's mindset and the nature of the crime. The act was not a spontaneous break, but a catastrophic failure of a family and a system to address years of escalating threats from a severely disturbed young man. The detailed, premeditated steps Scott took, getting the weapon, loading the magazines, researching police armor, ultimately spoke louder in the court of law than the diagnosis of his mental illness. The jury concluded that Scott's intent to kill was formed and carried out with a terrible method. The tragedy of the Kologi family massacre, therefore, stands as a chilling reminder of how a deep-seated mental illness, coupled with access to lethal force, can culminate in unimaginable domestic horror, forever blurring the line between madness and method. Stay tuned for the final part of our series, where we detail the devastating sentencing and the legal aftermath that sealed Scott Kologi's fate. A teenage boy, Scott Kologi, stood convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The jury determined that despite his struggles with mental health, his actions on New Year's Eve 2017 were calculated and intentional. Now, the courtroom drama gives way to the final, grim conclusion, the sentencing. This is the moment the state metes out its justice, and a community searches for meaning in a tragedy that defies comprehension. Subscribe to this channel and stay with us as we examine the final judgment and the devastating, long-term legacy of the Kologi family massacre. On February 24, 2022, 4 years after he turned his family's celebration into a slaughter, Scott Kologi, then 20 years old, was sentenced. The weight of his crimes, the murders of his mother Linda Kologi, his father Stephen Kologi, his sister Brittany Kologi, and family friend Mary Schultz, demanded the most severe punishment. Monmouth County Superior Court Judge Mark C. Lemieux handed down a sentence of 150 years in prison. This term was structured as 30 years for each of the 4 murder counts and the weapons offense, to be served consecutively. Crucially, the sentence was subject to New Jersey's No Early Release Act, NERA. This statute requires that Scott serve 85% of his sentence before becoming eligible for parole. This meant that the earliest possible date he could taste freedom would be after serving approximately 127.5 years. Judge Lemieux delivered a clear message during the sentencing, emphasizing that this term was intended to ensure Scott never see the light of the outside of a jail cell ever again. The sentence was a formal acknowledgement of the jury's finding. This was a calculated, evil, and deliberate act that warranted the ultimate penalty short of the death penalty, which New Jersey does not allow. The court acknowledged the defense's argument regarding Scott's mental health, but ultimately determined that his personal struggles could not mitigate the extreme, premeditated violence of his actions. While the sentence closed the legal chapter, the emotional devastation for the surviving family members remained an open wound. Stephen Kologi Jr., Scott's brother who owned the murder weapon, and the boy's grandfather, were the physical survivors, but their psychological trauma would endure indefinitely. They lost their nuclear family, parents and a sister, at the hands of their own son and grandson, on a night meant for joyous transition. Stephen Jr. was forced to live with the excruciating knowledge that the rifle, his legal property, was unsecured and was the instrument of his family's destruction. He provided crucial testimony during the trial, an agonizing act that meant confronting his brother's monstrous actions. The grandfather, Stephen Sr.'s father, had lost his son, his daughter-in-law, his granddaughter, and his longtime companion, Mary Schultz. The very place they once called home, the house on Wall Street, became a memorial to terror, forever stripped of its safe, familial meaning. For the Kologi family's extended network, the trauma was a ripple effect. Aunts, cousins, and friends left struggling to reconcile the boy they knew with the murderer he became. The massacre didn't just end 4 lives. It fractured the core of a family, leaving behind an indelible legacy of betrayal, grief, and complex guilt. Beyond the tragedy of one family, the Kologi case highlighted critical failures in 3 interconnected systems. First, the issue of gun access in the home. The weapon, an AK variant semi-automatic rifle, was legally owned, but its storage, removed from a safe and left in a closet with loaded magazines, was dangerously negligent. This case stands as a devastating example of how improper storage of lethal weapons can empower a disturbed individual to commit mass violence, regardless of legal ownership. Second, the debate over juvenile-adult prosecution. The decision to charge the 16-year-old Scott Kologi as an adult was a legal statement on the severity of the crime. While necessary due to the heinous nature of the murders, it reignited the national conversation about how the justice system should handle minors who commit acts of extreme violence, especially when mental illness is a factor. Third, the failure of the mental health system and the family unit. Scott's diagnosis of early-onset schizophrenia and his consistent threats to kill his family, documented in a text message and known to his mother, reveal a tragic oversight. His mother's fear of having him institutionalized led her to discourage him from sharing his true thoughts with his therapist. This case is a chilling lesson in the dangers of ignoring severe warning signs and failing to secure professional, institutional help for profound mental distress. Even after the conviction and the harsh sentence, profound questions remain unanswered, leaving the community to wrestle with the meaning of the tragedy. Could this have been prevented? If the rifle had remained locked in the safe, or if Scott had been institutionalized after expressing his homicidal thoughts, 4 people would likely be alive. The accumulation of small failures, improper gun storage, dismissed mental health warnings, created the perfect environment for the massacre. What role did Scott's isolation or special needs background play? The defense argued that Scott's years of being isolated, struggling with ADHD, and attending special needs schools compounded his mental fragility. Was his violence a cry for help that morphed into a terrifying act of self-destruction and homicidal rage, or did he simply exploit his known vulnerabilities? What does evil mean here? Prosecutors used the word evil to describe his deliberate actions. The trial's outcome suggests that the planning and intent transcended the excuse of mental illness. For the victims' families, the actions were simply evil. But for mental health advocates, the label simplifies a complex pathology. The case forces a difficult contemplation. Can a person be both desperately mentally ill and consciously, intentionally murderous? The justice system answered yes. The New Year's Eve that turned tragic in Long Branch has ended, but its lasting imprint is permanent. The image of a celebratory night transformed by gunfire, the family home forever transformed into a crime scene, and the stark reality of a young man whose life is now lost to the walls of a prison cell. These indelible facts summarize the tragedy. The story of Scott Kologi is a dark tableau of missed opportunities, systemic failures, and the brutal reality of mental illness left unchecked. It is a haunting reminder that the countdown to a new year can, for some, become the final, catastrophic tick of a broken clock. The Kologi family massacre will forever stand as a painful testament to the complexity of human darkness and the devastating cost of ignoring the clear warning signs.